Thank you so much. Welcome to the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, the largest institution in the United States devoted to the arts, sciences, and artists in movie making. The Academy Museum of Motion Pictures acknowledges the Tongva people as traditional caretakers of the water and land on which we program, curate, educate, convene, and discuss. We honor and respect Tongva ancestors and the Tongva community today, which continue to nurture this land and water through traditional practice, activism, art, and education. We also acknowledge their continued work to safeguard cultural resources. My name is Robert Renaud. I'm one of the associate programmers in the museum's film programs department. Thank you for joining us in our David Geffen Theater for the Cinematography panel presented as part of our Oscar nominee spotlights. Oscar nominee spotlights are made possible by the Ruderman Family Foundation. Oscar nominee spotlights is presented thanks to Afila by Sony Honda Mobility. Additional support provided by Clarendelle and Domaine Clarence Dillon and Champagne Lallier. Academy Museum film programming generously funded by the Richard Roth Foundation. I would like to thank our ASL interpreters who will be assisting today. Their names are Andrea Lust and Tim Lane. Nominee programs bring select screenings of Academy Award-nominated shorts and panels with Academy Award-nominated filmmakers in the lead-up to the 97th Oscars to the Academy Museum for the public. We have additional nominee programs later this week, including panels with the nominees from the categories of Best Picture and Makeup and Hairstyling and representatives for International Feature Film. The 97th Oscars will be held on Sunday, March 2nd, 2025 at the Dolby Theater at Ovation Hollywood and will be televised live on ABC and streamed live on Hulu. Before we begin our program, please silence, darken, and stow your mobile devices, including phones and smartwatches. Now, please help me in welcoming to the stage Meredith Shea, Chief Membership, Impact, and Industry Officer at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, who will share more about the nomination process.
Thank you, Bob. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, those of you virtually and those of you here with us in the theater, which I like to call a cathedral to cinema. On behalf of Academy CEO Bill Kramer and President Janet Yang, it really means so much to have all of you here with us. To quote Alfonso Cuarón, "In the history of cinema, masterpieces have existed without sound, without color, without a story, without actors, without music. But no single film has ever existed without cinematography." This year, 323 feature films qualified to be considered in the cinematography category. Members from the Academy's Cinematographers branch, a community of 341 members from over 50 countries, cast their ballots in January to determine the 5 films nominated for the 97th Oscars. Finals voting concluded last week, and all members of the Academy will vote to determine who takes home the Oscar statuette this Sunday on March 2nd. While I'm one person standing up here representing the Member Relations Global Outreach and Awards team, I want to give a very special thank you to Natalie Wade, Clark Eglinton, Kathleen Dimful, and Lily Iwohi for their work with this category and branch every single day. I truly appreciate your hard work, your dedication. This category and this event is simply not possible without you. Before I introduce our moderators for tonight's panel, I wanted to just take a moment to recognize that this is the first time that the Academy is ever hosting a public program highlighting cinematography Oscar nominees. That deserves a round of applause. Not all 5 nominees are here with us tonight, but we are thrilled to be celebrating all 5 of these outstanding achievements. And I also wanted to just recognize Paul Cameron, our 3rd cinematographer's branch governor. He is on location shooting, And we know he's watching from set, cheering us on, and I just wanted to say thank you, Paul, for always supporting us, for your dedication to the Academy and to cinematographers. And now on, yes. And now on for our moderators for this evening. Dion Beebe is serving his third consecutive year as governor in the cinematographer's branch, and he is currently the chair of the branch executive committee. His film credits include In the Cut, Collateral, and Edge of Tomorrow. In 2003, he received his first Oscar nomination for Best Cinematography for the film Chicago, and he won the award in 2006 for Memoirs of a Geisha. He is currently in production on Michael, the upcoming Michael Jackson biopic. Ellen Curris is serving her second term as governor of the cinematographer's branch. She is known for her director of photography work on such films as Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Blow, and the iconic black and white film Swoon. As a director, she received an Oscar nomination for Best Documentary Feature Film for The Betrayal in 2009, and she just released her first narrative directorial debut feature, Lee, starring Kate Winslet. Please join me in welcoming our two-thirds of our cinematographer branch governors, Dion, Ellen.
Hi, and welcome to our first ever cinematography branch screening and celebration of the nominees. Tonight we're here to celebrate the extraordinary work of 5 nominees, and just to remind everyone, they are Lowell Crawley for The Brutalist, Greg Frazier for Dune Part 2, Paul Guillaume for Emilia Perez, Ed Lachman for Maria, and Jaron Blanche for Nosferatu. Now as Ellen, yes, thank you. Now, as Ellen can attest as a sort of fellow governor of the cinematographer's branch, actually getting 5 cinematographers in a room together is probably more difficult than actually making a movie.
Yeah.
But we do, however, tonight have the amazing Ed Lachman and the incredibly talented Lowell Crawley with us. Now, each of the nominees tonight brings a unique artistry and vision to their respective films. To achieve this vision, they utilize an incredibly varied array of tools, from VistaVision and practically every format of celluloid, 35, 16, 8 millimeter, to the use of large format digital capture and even infrared photography. This, in my opinion, unbiased opinion, really makes cinematography the most exciting format in the Academy Awards sort of ceremony. Technology creates the tools, but these 5 cinematographers use those tools and create art.
My turn.
Your turn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. One thing I'm going to say about being a cinematographer and cinematographers is that we are a group of peers. It's a thing I've found throughout my whole career behind the camera is that when we get together, we're non-competitive, we support each other, we love being with each other, and it's a unique group of people who come together. And so, it's really something special. So I'm really happy that we're celebrating, our cinematographers tonight. So now that film is changing so rapidly, not only the formats, as Dion was mentioning, going from film to digital, but also now with the inclusion of AI and also, there's now the blurring of the lines between what we do and what other departments and other branches do. And so we, the cinematographers in our branch, wanted to kind of define what is a cinematographer? And oftentimes I've gotten asked, I'm sure you've gotten asked, Dion, what is a director of photography and what is a cinematographer, and are they the same? So we decided to sit down and kind of write a broad definition of who a cinematographer is. So I'll read that for you to share that with you. Because some people don't know, a lot of people in this audience do, being part of the film industry, but a lot of the public don't know, what do we do? The cinematographer, also known as the director of photography, is an artist whose canvas is the motion picture medium. They are responsible for visualizing and making artistic and technical decisions and bringing the director's vision to life, to the film. The cinematographer closely collaborates with the director and all the craft departments and oversees the camera, the grip, electric departments in directing the visual elements, which include lighting, framing, composition, camera motion, camera angles, capture medium and camera selection, lens choices, depth of field, color, exposure, filtration, and computer-generated elements. No wonder we never get to go to pee during the time that we're filming, right? I mean, really, as a cinematographer, you're on set all the time. Cinematographers also collaborate virtually with the animators, compositors, layout artists, and digital artists, all working together towards the director's goal. So that's our main job, is we realize the director's vision. It is generally accepted that feature films have one director of photography or principal photographer who serves as the director's chief visual partner. So there's, on some films there are multiple people, multiple cinematographers who are at play. But, when you think about the vision, there's a cinematographer, who's behind that vision and working closely with the director. So on that note, I think we would like to show you some of the clips of our nominees. Thank you.
This is magic. Thank you.
Darling, there will be a big party tonight. I remember much love and party.
You are my destiny. You are what you are to be. You are my happiness.
I remember.
Hey Giada, vieni. Tu sei il mio grande vecchio amico.
solo los niños, los narcos, los ratanaderos los llevan afuera de todos sus pueblos natales. A cambio de eso, Santos reduce los juicios a falta de pruebas. Habla, esta gente habla, pero ahora lo van a pagar, a pagar, a pagar. Habla, esta gente habla, pero lo van a pagar, lo van a pagar.
Ustedes me sacan ventaja, todo el mundo los conoce, a mí nadie.
I'd like to welcome to the stage first our nominees, Ed Lachman, nominated for Maria. Lal Crawley, nominated for The Brutalist. And our two cinematography branch governors, Dion Beebe and Ellen Kuras.
Now you get to hear cinematographers talk, which is exactly what we train to do.
As we mentioned earlier, only two of the nominees are available tonight. Two of the other ones, fortunately, were able to send statements about their work in the film. I'll read one of them now because it actually pertains to the first question. Paul Guillaume, who shot Emilia Perez, sent this statement. It is the third time Jacques Audiard and I have worked together. He called me when he directed the last two episodes of the 5th season of The Bureau, a French spy TV series. We then worked in the black and white film Paris, 13th District. Then he calls me what was still an evolving project or a hybrid object that had to do with opera. That would become Emilia Perez. We talked a lot about the incredible film An Old New Play by Qiu Zhangzhong. This film is between the opera and pure cinema. We follow a character through different periods and places. The blocking, decoration, and cinematography is always very simple, but extremely precise and poetic. We also contemplated the work of modern photographers to find exactly how to integrate darkness in the film. We already knew that whatever form the film would take, black had to be one of its key elements. There is a signature shot in all of Jacques' filmography that is a handmade iris effect that is kind of vibrating, isolating the character from the world. In this one, once it was decided that it would all be shot in a studio to avoid too much realism, it occurred that we could have the same result of isolating the main characters from the world by simply switching off the light for the world on a specific line. In terms of grading, set decoration, colors, the Safdie brothers' work throughout their last films is an absolute reference to me. We mainly worked on Sony Venice 1 and 2 cameras with Blackwing Tribe 7T tuned lenses. The colorist Arthur Pau did a fantastic job in finding the correct texture for this film. The musical numbers are the most challenging to shoot, also because each one of them is different from the others, from a minimalist shot reverse in a blacked-out world or a big scene with 150 dancers. One of the opening scenes where Zoe is imagining her plea in a street market that builds itself around her was shot using only practicals. All of the market stalls were in wheels with onboard batteries and Bluetooth receivers and could be switched on and off from a console depending on the camera angle and allowing the Steadicam operator, Sasha Nasseri, to move around freely and to film everything. I had the chance to meet Thomas Garreau, the gaffer of the film, on the advice of cinematographer Nicolas Deloire. He has done an incredible job in bringing the lighting work further than I could dream. So that leads me to my first question. For Ed, now, Maria was directed by Pablo Larraín, who you worked with previously on El Conde, which also brought you to the Oscars last year for a nomination. Could you talk about working with Pablo on these movies and what sort of the visual approach you guys conceived for Maria?
Well, number one, thank you, the Academy, for honoring all of us and cinematography in general. Not all directors are visual, but certainly all the directors that we're here with, cinematographers, are visual. And Pablo is a very visual. And what I was attracted to Pablo from the very beginning, from his earliest films like Tony Manero and The Club, is I always found every film and story that he portrayed found its own language. And for me, cinematography or images are more than representational. And they, for me, are the language of cinema. What makes cinema different than a painting, a play, a book, right? Thank you. Is that we move in time and space and the relationship of that time and space. So I found, and working with Pablo on El Conde first, is that in all these films I find have found the visual metaphor, the strength of cinematography for me in telling a story is the metaphor of the images of what it represents. So here we did a film about Maria Callas, but actually the film becomes an opera about Maria Callas and deals with the same thematics and values of what an opera is. And so one of the approaches that I used is I wanted to place the audience in the seat as if they're experiencing an opera. So I don't know if that answered all of your question, but that's the reason I was drawn to Pablo. And obviously El Conde was a reference to, a film, Gothic noir, and this was really an opera.
Now, Lal, you worked with Brady Corbet on The Brutalist, and sort of a personal note, I started working here over 20 years ago, and we used to have a media literacy seminar where we'd show films to high school students, and about the first one I remember screening was the movie 13 with Holly Hunter, and Brady Corbet came because he played the teenage son of Holly Hunter in the film. But he's since become a director, and you've shot all three of his films, The Child of a Leader, Vox Lux, and The Brutalist. And I understand that you actually started discussing The Brutalist while working on Vox Lux like 7 years ago. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a real rarity to find a collaborator who you shoot the second movie with, and you wrap, and then he presents you with a book on brutalist architecture and says, "This is the next one." You know, I mean, we dream of kind of collaborators like that. You know, because it just displays trust and friendship, and yeah, it means a great deal to have that kind of relationship and so on. I mean, Brady was, it was Brady's Childhood of a Leader was Brady's first film, and it wasn't my first film. I'd had a few under my belt by then. But he was an incredibly assured filmmaker right from the beginning, very kind collaborator, but very assured, like a case in, I mean, across all three films, there's a commonality. I think Brady has kind of alluded to this, but there's definitely a sort of unofficial trilogy to the three films, if you like, and visually they echo and reference each other in some ways, and each film takes on an examination of a sort of fictitious central character that is iconic in some way in the time that they exist, and Brady's examination of modernity versus antiquity, and which I find I smile because there's humor in the film, a lot of the time, about that, either the rant that Natalie Portman's character has in Vox Lux, or having watched the 3 hours of The Brutalist to then be presented with this imagery from 1980s and that being perceived as some form of progress, So he's always kind of playing with, I mean, whether you like Brady's films or not, they're never dull. There's always, they're big swings. They're why I got into it, which is to go see a movie, and if you have time after seeing this movie, to go to the pub or have a meal and really talk about it, and that's really why I got into it, But yeah, it's, I mean, did that answer some of your questions?
Well, I'm also curious because that's such a long time to develop, and I understand that it was almost made a few years earlier with an entirely different cast. So over that period of time, do you talk about it regularly? What are the sort of like things that come up between you as far as how you're going to approach the film,
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't really tend to storyboard. There was one sequence in the movie that we storyboarded. We shot list to a certain extent, and we are very prepared. I mean, I think, the movie was 33 days for somewhere around a $10 million budget. So we are very responsible as filmmakers, we
Got that in 33 days?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, everybody who knows 33 days is nothing, really,
it's
for a 3.5 hour
squeeze two
film.
movies out of it, essentially. But so yeah, we're very prepared, but a lot of that preparation, almost from the first movie we did together, is a kind of a common taste, and the more you can minimize, not confrontation, that's the wrong word, but the more you can minimize discussion on set, the more you can try and be aligned as one brain, then you can just get on and do it. More than sort of. And I've always thought that the role of a cinematographer, if you're sort of cast or chosen correctly, kind of 75% or 80% of what you suggest generally has resonance and sticks to the wall. If it's a lot less than that, you're probably the wrong person, and you don't get precious about the 15% that gets knocked back or isn't quite right, and that's how I regard the role, and you have to be aligned, and you have to be on the right project, and you have to, So in answer to the question, I suppose is there is a kind of, there's a common. We have a common taste. It's interesting. A lot of the time with directors, I don't know if you find this, but directors have a strong opinion about camera movement and framing, but a lot of the time when it comes to the lighting, they don't necessarily. You kind of get left alone a little bit more. Like I mean, obviously, if it's a kind of certain time of day that needs to be articulated, or often, not often, but sometimes it might be like, is it a little bright, and sometimes it is, and so you take another look at it, and it's a constant case of calibrating each other, I think, and staying on the straight and narrow.
I just want to get back to what you're talking about and what you were talking about, Ed, about visual metaphor, which is really so important in what we do. is not only creating cool shots, because that's not just the cinematography. It's about, how can we tell this story with the camera? Every shot has a meaning. Every shot has a beginning, middle, and an end, and there's a reason for why you pan from left to right. There's a reason for why the lighting is the way it is. There's a reason for that. So, you're putting forth a lot of ideas. It's just not like, oh, cool, let's just have this Steadicam shot that goes all the way through this, and isn't that cool? It's really about the story that you're trying to tell, every single story. Every time you move the camera, every time you set a light, it has a certain kind of vibe. And that's what you were, both of you are talking about is, that the director, has a certain vision or an idea about the story that want to tell. And then you're, visualizing it or you're making that real. But those decisions are made according to the story and what the message is and what you want to tell. Right.
Yeah, and I'm just sort of want to go back to 33 days because it just gives me like anxiety. But no, but certainly, I understand that, when if you are, and you would have known that, and I think for you, Ed, it was also I think 44 days or still these sort of pretty tight schedules, for these sort of pretty epic movies. And I'm just curious to hear from both of you just in terms of, because hearing that and knowing as you went in that this was going to be a sort of certain limitation or is the preparation. Because it really sort of in the end comes down to that. It's like, okay, this is the time we have. This is the story we need to tell. And I do know from being on set that the more you are prepared, the more you can pivot and anticipate and deal with those sorts of limitations. But I'm just curious from each of you, just that preparation process. Maybe Ed, you can.
Well, to go along with this idea, for me, I always feel a cinematographer is another actor in a way, because if it's acting is acting and reacting, that's what we are. And for me, with the operating, you want to be in the moment, in the response. So more and more, I light the space and let the action happen in the space. And by doing that, I can capture something of the emotion of what the world, like I said, the two factors for me in approaching this as an opera was that the camera was a proscenium. It's the moving stage. So he had a tendency to want to use wider lenses, a 21, 24, 28, where it's moving with her, so you become part of her world, and a subjective viewpoint where you're seeing her point of view in space. And then the other part was the use of color. The color's been used psychologically. My background was painting, and so I've always looked to people like Johann Goethe, who wrote a book in 1810 that every school in painting you read about the interpretation of color, or Joseph Albers in the 60s wrote a book. So for me, the color can affect the audience emotionally, and that's something also that I try to bring to it. And for me, it was there was such a wealth of information visually about her life, and that's why we ended up with Super 8, because that was the most personal relationships where she had her guard down, and Ferruccio, the butler, had done a lot of filming of her. And then there's a projection of her mind with a Super 8, with a Super 16, in which she's projecting what her thoughts and feelings are about her past. And then there's the black and white negative, 35 millimeter past, and then the color is the contemporary time. So all those elements had a way of reaching the interior world, and I think that's what we all strive for, is how do we create images that equate the interior world? Because I always say, like in literature, it's very easy to show place where you are. No, I'm sorry. It's very easy to show the interior world in a sentence or paragraph. You can say how a person thinks. Now, in film, it's more difficult. You can do it with voiceover, but it's harder to show that visually through the camera And so you can show place with one shot. So I think that's using these different elements help the viewer be more incisive into her world.
Now, it occurred to me that both these films are essentially about artists of a type. I mean, it struck me that working on research for this, that Brutalist is almost like a biopic of a fictional person. And it's sort of the modern style biopic, like Lincoln, that only focuses on the Emancipation Proclamation, or Selma, that shows King's life through the Selma March. This is Toff's life through basically this one project, this one assignment. Now, how do you feel in making a film essentially about an artist and their work, that you're sort of shooting it from sort of using their art as a perspective? Like, I was eavesdropping at dinner, you referred to I think it was Harris Savidi's work on Birth, someone said as brutalist cinematography. Were you trying in any way for a look of the film that would sort of reflect Toff's own very specific artistic viewpoint, his sort of eye, basically?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think Brady's spoken about the film as being sort of both maximalist and minimalist in some ways, and I think what he means by that is it is a kind of examination of the architecture and of this fictitious central character's work. But personally, I tend to approach. I mean, it's interesting because you could in some ways say that the way that I approach cinematography, or whatever I bring to it, that I think is I don't know what it is, but it's the way that it's a sensibility, I suppose, or how I like or how I respond, and it's less impositional. It's more being reactive, as Ed was saying. In a way, that's in opposition in some ways to brutalist architecture, you know, and architecture by its very nature is kind of inanimate, and has a state, and we're talking about moving image, you know. So it's really interesting, this kind of interplay. So in many ways, I didn't go like as deep into the brutalist architecture as Judy did, for example. I mean, really, most of the conversations were about, okay, certainly in the second half of the film, when the Institute becomes manifest, it's like, okay, what is this going to feel like to the audience? What would this feel like to somebody that was actually there? So it was about, you know, focal length, height of camera, how the speed that the camera's moving through, and things like this, you know. And then, you know, the whole film is a contrast between this quite sort of, you know, we have VistaVision, of course, which is, you know, somebody said it's almost a slab of celluloid, you know. So there is this kind of link, if you like, between this kind of thing.
Can you explain what VistaVision is?
Of course, and I'll try and keep it brief. But essentially, when you're shooting on a 35mm motion picture camera, it pulls the film through vertically 2, 3, 4 perforations at a time. 24 times a second. With VistaVision, it's still 35mm film. It's exactly the same film, but you pull it through horizontally like you would with a stills camera, and it's pulled through 8 perforations at a time. So essentially, it's closer to twice the neg area, and as a consequence, you end up with a wider field of view. It's kind of the original sort of full frame 35. So if you have a wider field of view, it means you're not forced onto a wider lens to get to capture the architecture or the vistas of the Carrara marble quarries, you know. So that was the one of the reasons that Brady wanted to explore it. And then secondly, it's a format that sort of originated in the 1950s. Hitchcock famously used it on Vertigo and other films, I think. But our film kind of owes a debt to sort of, it takes place during the 1950s, a lot of it. And as Brady said, it also has elements of sort of 50s melodrama to it. So he felt that it was an appropriate camera format for that.
Now, similarly, Ed, with Maria, I mean, it's very much about Maria Callas. So much of it's literally her perspective, whether it's her flashback memories, whether they're real or not, her hallucinations in the present, and the music is such a big part of it. Now, were there ways where, how could you talk about how her personality, particularly music choices in the film, may have influenced the way that you photograph the scenes?
Mm-hmm. Well, Pablo is very well versed and loves opera, and he picked sections of the operas that equated kind of the experience of what she's going through in that part of her life. And what was interesting is he said he subtitled the language of the opera and showed it that way and realized it was all wrong because it was too literal. Because another aspect of opera is, and even Maria Callas said, is it's about the emotion. It's not about logic. And what is cinema but emotion? So he also made the comparison to say to me, there's many similarities between opera and cinema. And that's what I want to equate. That's what I want us to do. So even if the audience doesn't understand what she's singing, they'll feel something. And I think that's the strength of what we do with our images, is that we can feel something. For me, images are like music. They're a nonverbal form of communication that can touch people if you do it the right way.
Now, this actually relates to the next question. Greg Fraser, who shot Dune Part 2, is nominated for that. Actually, he sent a piece to read specifically about the clip that we saw. When I first read the sandworm writing scene in the Dune Part 2 script, I had a slight anxiety attack. I had never seen anything like this before, and I couldn't find a reference for anything of the magnitude the scene was aiming to achieve. There were no action scenes in my mind, no documentary moments that could give the scene the weight it needed. So instead, I began to look at references that were a bit unconventional. I thought about skiers in avalanche situations, surfers nearly drowning with GoPros, anything that showed humans confronting massive forces. Essentially, we were trying to depict the experience of human riding something so enormous that it's beyond our comprehension. I imagined myself trying to ride a whale, or even trying to ride in a massive train. One reference we found was train surfing, as odd as it sounds. But it was highly appropriate as it captured the idea of a human attempting to control something much larger than themselves. Another challenge we faced was that the sandworm sequence only lasted 5 or 6 minutes in the movie. As anyone who's worked on a film knows, when you're shooting such a short amount of screen time, you typically only spend 10 or 11 days on those minutes. On most films, you might spend about 2 minutes of screen time per day, but this sequence is completely different. Every shot needed a unique setup, and we couldn't just fit it into a standard box of filmmaking. Every camera mount had to be different. The aspirations for the scene were incredibly high, which meant we had to spend more time in preparation than I've ever had to for any other scene. The solution we came up with was creating what we called a worm unit. It wasn't a second unit because Denis and I were leading it, but it was staffed with professionals we trusted to deliver the best results. My other cinematographers, Danny Villar and Christophe Brandl, did a lot of the R&D for the scenes. Tanya Lapointe, one of our producers, also stepped in to represent Denis on the unit. Thanks to this smaller dedicated worm unit, we were able to shoot for longer periods of time, which meant we could achieve better results with less pressure from the inevitable budget constraints. Now, Lal, what would you say was the most challenging scene to shoot on The Brutalist?
I think it was probably one that looks to the eye as one of the most straightforward and simplest, and that was probably the scene after Van Buren. Van Buren decides that he's going to announce this institute on the top of the hill, and it's sort of wintertime, and he marches everybody up to this hilltop, and then sort of catches Laszlo by surprise by suggesting that he takes this commission, you know, and basically the reason it was challenging was that it's a long scene with a lot of dialogue, and we shot it basically in about 45 minutes, literally from the sun setting to the point where we didn't have the exposure to expose the film. And it wasn't intended that way. I think it was it was a cloud, or that was the worst case scenario that we kind of denied it being a possibility. It was a kind of a cloudy day. and we were like, well, that's okay because we can, you know, as long as it's not super bright, we can, you know, there's no hard sun, we can time this down. And so we were blocking the scene, and everyone's up on the hillside. But then about an hour and a half before sunset, the clouds broke, and you know we had this kind of magic hour. So I had to turn to Brady and say, "Well, no, we're not going to shoot until the sun actually sets," you know. And as I was, you know, it was. I was nervous saying it and nervous committing, you know. But you have to commit, and you have to sound like you know, you have to just kind of go with it and convince everyone. And we did it, you know, and it's actually a testament to the actors, it's testament to the Steadicam operator, it's testament to Brady's direction, you know. I mean, it looks like there's many shots in the scene. It's actually essentially sort of 2 Steadicam developing shots, and we shot them at 90 degrees to each other, so we cheated the background 90 degrees. Which was pretty successful. But the thing I also really like about that scene is that the French have this term, the time between the dog and the wolf, meaning the very poetic way of describing twilight, and you know the time between the tame and the untamed, between the hidden, the unhidden, what you think is one thing. And what's so interesting is that whole scene is the start of their Faustian pact almost. You know, it's their moment where he's accepting it, but he doesn't fully realize exactly what he's accepting. And I think, you know, and it has this, I think that aesthetically, our colorist, Mate, and I sort of, it's imbued with this kind of strange, uncanny light that I've always been fascinated by, and this kind of silvery quality, like in the work of Gregory Crutzen, or a more sort of court moment would be like Todd Heido's photography, or like Melancholia, another, you know, von Trier's film. I'm always really interested with this idea of kind of light, something very unsettling when light is unmotivated or there's a disconnect, you know, like you see the light falling a certain way, but it's not motivated. And it's the same in Andrew Wyeth's paintings. That's why I like his work. And it's not immediately apparent. There's just something very unsettling and uncanny and strange about it. And anytime I'm able to sort of capture this slight contradiction in the light, it intrigues me.
Well, it's also ironic, given in the scene, the characters are actually complaining about how cold they are and having to wait, when you're saying they were able to shoot it remarkably quickly. So now, Ed, similarly, was there anything specifically challenging, whether in a practical sense or just aesthetically in Maria, that really stood out for you?
Well, always La Scala. It was a discussion from the beginning that Pablo had to shoot there. It was so instrumental in her life. But of course, it was very prohibitive expense-wise and the time. They only gave us, finally, they negotiated 4 hours because they have productions going in and out. So within that 4 hours, I had to be the most efficient way of lighting that incredible space. And the way I dealt with it is, I used actually the lighting crew for the stage because I knew they would know their instruments and what I could do with their board. And my film crew that came in from Germany, and I implemented with Italians, I just brought the level up with the cheapest par cans, bounced off the ceiling, and then brought in a higher output for a projector. And I had lit it in 45 minutes, and we shot the rest with a Steadicam and placed it all together. So that was the most hair-raising because in 4 hours they kicked us out of there. And so that's, I get it or I don't.
Let's talk about, you guys are going to
Please.
Let's talk about the difference between digital and film. Because if you're looking at, I mean, just for example, in your film, you know, if you're looking at a wider view, couldn't you get that in digital, and why the choice to do film?
It's a big question in terms of my work with Brady. I mean, as I sort of suggested, the 3 films share a commonality, a language, and therefore they're all shot on film. And I think they're all period films, even though Vox Lux is a period much closer to current day. But for us, there's something, there's something really important about the alchemical process, and it's the difference between it's tied in for me and Brady, I think, with the idea that if you're shortlisting and you're storyboarding 2 weeks before and you're looking at this and this is how you're going into the scene and you're how do I put A to B to C, you're not looking at the space and the performance and being open, I think, to the world and being sort of allowing yourselves to respond in the moment, right? Now, for me, shooting film is an extension of that. And it's about almost losing control a little bit. It's about, even though I've shot 12 movies on film, and I've shot more, but 12 of the movies have been on film. Even though that's the case, we still hand it over at the end of the day, and it goes through this alchemical process, right? And you get it back, and anyone who's taken stills and brought, there's a wonderful joy in when you get your image back, and you're like, oh, that's how it comes out. Now
There's an image.
yeah. There's also when that's fine when you're taking a stills, you're shooting stills for your own joy. It's very, very nerve-wracking and a lot of responsibility when you're doing this, on a motion picture film, right? But anyway, the important thing is that all I can say, I think, if I had to be really concise about this, is that the most boldest, bravest images that I've ever made have been shooting film, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? Because you think, oh, well, if I have a digital camera on set and I have an image, I can make it darker and I can see what I'm doing. And I don't know, can't tell you why it doesn't work that way, but it just doesn't work that way. The boldest image, an image. I got an image back on the Brutalist with Adrian in the coal field, right? And he's standing on some coal, and then there's Isaac de Boncolet, and then there's Guy Pearce in the foreground. As soon as I got that image back, I ran up to Guy and I went, I have no idea how we did this, And, that seems surprising as the cinematographer to be like, but part of me doesn't know how that stuff came together. And that's important to me, and that's what I get from shooting film.
There's a different aesthetically, though, in the feeling between digital and film, and I'd be curious to hear what you also have to say about that, Ed, because last year...
Because I've shot many films in period with Todd Haynes and with Pablo. One, I like to use film because it references the language that you're looking at, that you're referencing, but on a maybe pseudo-technical level, there are 3 layers, RGB, and to me it becomes an etching. There's depth to the image in film that you don't get digitally because it's pixel fixated on one plane, your light, dark, and your colors. The other important thing is I like to think of film like oil paint because my background is painting. And when you have like cool color coming in the window from daylight and you're shooting tungsten film and you warm up the lights inside, with quarter CTO or whatever, somewhere there's a mixture of green because blue and yellow become green in oil paint. The way I think of digital is, and it's not just to be pejorative, is it's like watercolor. When the blue comes in the window and it meets the warm, you see the blue, you see the warm. You don't get the crossover contamination. And that, to me, gives you depth to the image, like these 3 layers that are etched when they're exposed. And even though you go through a DI, you're still capturing something of the depth.
Yeah, because it's photochemical, as you were saying, alchemical, the RGB, red, green, blue layers. But it's physical, so there's a melding and a 3-dimensionality to the actual physical object.
And also the grain structure, when you have highlights, the grain is finer. And when you have low light and underexposure, the grain is larger. And that's moving as your frame is moving. And you don't get that in digital. I mean, you can do things like live grain that maps the exposure and tries to give you that grain. But if you just overlay grain from film, it's not the same as film.
Now, do you find, I'm just going to jump in here for a second, because I've experimented with when you do a digital film, that you make a interpositive, internegative, physical intermediate of that digital information, that and I found doing, having done a DI, when I then go back to film, that the film actually feels more filmic. So if you do a digital film and then you do an intermediate that's film, it actually is closer to film, right? So you actually
Very
get that.
expensive, and I don't get to work on those kinds.
But essentially baking in a celluloid element that is not in capture, but is a post element.
Three-dimensionality.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
inherent in
Yeah.
the physical property of the film.
I mean, one thing I was just going to say, I mean, I haven't done that to answer your question, but one thing I was going to say was that the other thing that Brady and I have enjoyed doing, and I have since Ballast, which was the first film I shot, was that even modern Kodak stocks, I mean, they're beautiful, but they are modern stocks. And so we've kind of abused them in a way, Brady and I, by underexposing them. And I remember Childhood of a Leader, which we shot in Budapest. We went to this Rembrandt exhibition, and very, I mean, I studied painting for a time as well. I didn't paint in the way that Ed has, but you realize, you rarely would use black pigment, So we talk about cinematography owing this debt to photography and celebration of rich blacks. We were like, well, we don't really want that. We want to bring, the shadows to be made up of browns and purples and things. All of the way you would layer it up, and the way that we also realized that what the pictorialists were doing in the early, with the advent of photography, that were trying to stop it, trying to elevate it from being just a capture medium. They were trying to make it be become an art form. I was like, oh, of course, that's what it is, So it's that pictorialist kind of softening, painterly, and Brady's storytelling is all about a dream of a dream of a dream. It's not really about Laszlo Toth's this brutalist architecture. It's about so many other things, and it just felt like that. The film captured that.
Yeah, I just want to quickly talk about, I know we're sort of running out of time a little bit, but camera movement, firstly because I love the fact that we can talk about that Greg's talking about the worm unit. I mean, only in movie making do we have a worm unit, but it's just that, we're often sort of, given these tasks as cinematographers to sort of explore an idea, and some of those ideas are sort of just purely a sort of aesthetic, or they're physical, like we have to, like with Greg's challenge with the worm unit is how do we capture the weight and the scale of this sort of scene, an event. And, then I look at Paul's work on Emilia Perez, and there's this sort of dynamic, bold camera movement. It's raw, and it's just coming head on, and so I'm sort of curious, whether, for each of you, mostly now we're all sort of employing operators, sometimes we're operating ourselves, but just that's the other sort of interpretation, because yes, there's the lighting, there's the mood, there's the atmosphere, but then it's like, how am I capturing movement, and how am I sort of telling the story through movement, and or not, or through stillness. And I look at Maria, and I see, from sort of these sweeping sort of operatic moments to this incredible stillness, so.
Well, it really becomes whose point of view you're telling the story through, and is the camera motivated or unmotivated? And I think what you said is true, that the camera, we looked at Visconti, I looked at Lola Montez. So for me, the camera didn't have to be motivated in this film, because we wanted something to embellish the world, that there was an artifice to the world. And so the camera movement is also an artifice.
Well, I think there's a certain formality within the film and a sort of formalism, especially when Laszlo is having these conversations with Van Buren. And, you know, often I'm thinking of meeting that I had when Van Buren is hungover, and the camera is very much just kind of quite formal in those moments, you know. But then there's these very intimate moments that are handheld that I really enjoy doing, and I love handheld. I've often said, to the point where I sometimes have to catch myself that I'm serving the story and not serving my own enjoyment of handheld, you know, because it's just, anyone who's done it, it's like a dance, you know. It's this beautiful interplay, call and response with the actor, and it's kind of mesmerizing, you know. It's a very joyful thing to do. But then Brady, you know, right from the beginning, with Child of a Leader and Vox Lux, there's two things. One is he's explored this idea of this thing that we've termed the untethered camera. So when you think you're doing one thing, suddenly the camera sort of gets lifted up, or the Statue of Liberty gets to, you know, and suddenly it, you know, untethers itself, which is a device that he kind of brought to it and we've enjoyed expanding on, or sort of inverting the camera, you know, in a suggestion that the world is inverted in some way. And then also Brady throws down the gauntlet. He says, listen, you know, the point where Elisabeth accuses Van Buren in The Brutalist, it's a 5-minute scene shot on film. I want it to be a Steadicam shot that then turns into a handheld shot that then becomes Steadicam again. But I don't want to cut, and I want to just, how do we do it, you know? And we had this amazing Attila Pfeffer, this fantastic Hungarian Steadicam operator, and he operated the whole scene Steadicam, and then the point where Elisabeth's walker gets ripped out from under her, he literally, I've never seen anyone really do this, but he sort of handheld the camera with a Steadicam hanging off it. It was a very it was incredible. I mean, a wonderful sort of like incredible feat of operating. And then he sort of righted the whole rig again, and up he went on the stairs, you know. But it's interesting because Brady, that comes from Brady, this ambition, this kind of audacity to do it. And even though that was the third film that we had worked on together, there's the moment where Elisabeth accuses Van Buren, we're just in profile on her. And I was like, but you know, what about the reaction, you know? And he said, no, we're never going to. And I thought, oh, okay, you know, and I'm, you know, I went with it, but I was like, okay, that's a really bold choice, you know. So even 3 films in, and he was completely right, you know, it's perfect. But in the moment, I was like, oh, okay, all right, okay, fair enough.
That's interesting, actually. Both your clips sort of demonstrate that, because your clip in the Quarry is handheld through the dance, and as soon as we see Van Buren, it settles into a sort of more sort of controlled sort of, and I think that's how you sort of, and then again with yours, Ed, you know, you've got Maria sort of just sort of laid out in her apartment, completely still and just sort of trapped. And then we sweep through this sort of moment, this recollection, and then culminating in that sort of incredible Super 8 footage that just becomes raw and sort of visceral.
It's interesting. While Lowell was speaking, it made me remember something that I was also in opposition to at the time. You know, you see the documentary crew filming her, and he chose to be hand-held showing the documentary crew. And I thought that would be a violation, like, who is this other camera person filming the documentary crew, that would confuse visually the audience, like, where did that come from? But then I realized when I'm looking at the footage, it's in her mind. So why wouldn't she think of showing a documentary crew like it's in a documentary? And I would question him, and he never could give me an answer why. He just felt that's the way we should do it, and then maybe I justified it, but I think it works that way.
I think we create rules only to break them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Now it's almost time to wrap up. I'd just like to ask Dion and Ellen, do you have any final question, either of you, for each or both of our guests tonight?
I have a big question, but it's probably more than we have time for. It's just the interaction of visual effects, which I saw very much so in Greg's film. That's probably the most visual effects movie, but, the interaction between, planning for those visual effects. And that was part of the challenge of what Greg was going through, trying to figure out how to get the feeling of what was happening in that scene, interacting with the visual effects augmentation of what was going to happen in that scene. I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but it is something that we all have to deal with in a very real way, is talking to the visual effects people who are on set with us and just talking about how we can prepare what they're going to have to do to augment. And, I could see that in both of your films, but not as much as we saw in Dune 2, certainly, and a little bit in Nosferatu. But, so much of you guys were, was on set, live action, as we would say. Yeah.
And Dion, do you have any final question?
No,
Or
no.
statement?
Just can you explain AI to the audience? No, I don't. No, I just really appreciate what both of you is, your conversation tonight, and as this is our sort of first, cinematographers sort of panel. I just want to say from Ellen and I how much we appreciate you both being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And before we go, Lal and Ed, is there anyone you'd like to acknowledge that you worked with on the film, that helped on the film, that you haven't had the chance to mention tonight, that were particularly important to your work on those films?
Well, I did 8 films with Todd Haynes, and he's greatly influenced, how you prepare for a film, how you aesthetically approach a film. And the only other person is I worked with a gaffer, an American gaffer, John DeBlau, for over 40 years. And even when I'm like thousands of miles away, I have no problem calling him up and talking to him about a shot or a scene and what we would do. And he always gave me the confidence and the input that I could never get from anybody else.
I mean, my Hungarian crew that I've now shot 3 films in Hungary, and I trust them, and I'm only as good as the crew that support me, and it's a lot of responsibility, and it's trust. It's the same it comes back to trust and communication and kindness and forgiveness sometimes, and but also I don't come from a documentary background, but I definitely feel there's something of the documentarian in the aesthetic, so a sort of response to available light, response to a space, things like that that I really cherish. I regard myself as not so much of an impositional cinematographer. I very much, Chris Doyle said, it's about, here's the world, how do we frame it? And when he said that, it really, that's what I am, and also Robbie Mueller, he said, listen, if you're just going to shoot the script, why bother, And I think that's fantastic, because and it is about that. It's like, it's great. So it's having your eyes open to the accidental, and anyone that's inspired that, I'm very grateful to.
I'd also like to thank the ASL folks who are here. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank Dion, Ellen, Lal, and Ed for joining us, and also acknowledge Greg, Jaron, and Paul, the other nominees, and just congratulations, all of you, on your just remarkable work in what is a remarkable field. Just so much great cinematography today. That is just, and the fact that you're here, it's such an honor for all of us. And thank you so much for coming tonight.
And I thank Bob.
Thank you all for coming.